Hey everyone, Danny Tavis here. Canada just hit the US with a massive electricity shock, and Trump's past moves are coming back to haunt him. Let's break it down.
Escalation in President Trump's trade war with Mexico and Canada. A new order from the White House effectively doubling tariffs on steel and aluminum imports to a whopping 50%.
It started with metal, it escalated with cars, and now it has hit the grid. Canada has just delivered the most shocking retaliation in its decades-long relationship with the United States, not with missiles, not with sanctions, but with something far more destabilizing: electricity. In a move that stunned regulators from New York to Michigan, Ontario has slapped a 25% surcharge on power exports to the United States, and that is only the beginning, because this is not just about power lines. It is about a trade war that has broken into the wires, the grids, and the homes of millions of Americans, and if this conflict escalates, entire U.S. regions could be pushed to the brink of rolling blackouts, industrial shutdowns, and political chaos. Before we continue, hit that like button to help us beat the YouTube algorithm and to show your support. The warning came months ago. Ontario's Premier, Doug Ford, made it clear if the United States kept targeting Canada with tariffs, Ontario would strike back where it hurts, in electricity, and in March, he followed through. The surcharge kicked in. U.S. states like Michigan, New York, and Minnesota, which depend heavily on imported Canadian hydropower, saw their rates spike overnight, and then came the threat no one expected. Doug Ford said on record that if the White House escalates again, Ontario will shut the electricity off completely. That is not a political statement. That is a grid-level threat because more than 1 million American homes and businesses rely on Canadian power to keep their lights on, and there is no substitute. But Ontario is not acting alone. Manitoba allowed 2 long-term export contracts to the United States, 500 megawatts of hydropower, to quietly expire in April. The official reason: to repatriate that energy for domestic use. The real reason: leverage, because when power becomes politics, provinces turn inward, and now Quebec is weighing the same. U.S. energy regulators are scrambling. The New York Independent System Operator and New England grid managers have already begun drafting emergency plans. These regions import 5 to 10% of their electricity from Canada. They rely on cheap hydropower to stabilize their grids during extreme heat or cold. If those flows are disrupted, the fallback plan is brutal. Fire up older, oil-fired plants, bring in expensive liquefied natural gas, and brace for grid instability. Even Minnesota, which receives relatively little power from Ontario, is preparing for a worst-case scenario. That is how serious this has become, because this is not just about electricity anymore. It is about control. It is about who holds the power, literally. When tariffs turn into trade war, the United States started this. On March 4th, President Donald Trump imposed sweeping 25% tariffs on virtually all imports from Canada and Mexico. That included food, metals, electronics, and, most critically, the raw materials that make up the backbone of North America's industrial economy, and Canada responded. First, it hit back with tariffs on $30 billion worth of U.S. goods, everything from orange juice to building materials. Then it turned to something far more strategic: energy. Trump fired back again. On March 12th, the United States doubled its tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum from 25% to 50%. The White House claimed Ontario's electricity surcharge was provocative, but behind closed doors. Officials were scrambling because even they knew if Canada cuts the wires, the lights go out. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who replaced Justin Trudeau in late March, is playing a high-stakes game of chess. He told Parliament that Canada is actively negotiating with Washington to end the tariffs, but he also said clearly that Canada is preparing full reprisals if those talks fail. In fact, within days of the U.S. tariff hike, Canada imposed nearly 30 billion Canadian dollars in retaliatory measures, and at the same time, it filed formal challenges against the United States at both the World Trade Organization and under the USMCA trade agreement. This is no longer a dispute. This is a legal, diplomatic, and industrial war. And while Canada sharpens its tools, Mexico is charting a different path. President Claudia Sheinbaum has publicly condemned Trump's tariffs, especially the 50% duty placed on Mexican steel. but instead of retaliating immediately. Mexico has opted for negotiation. Behind the scenes, U.S. and Mexican officials are working on a compromise. The deal would allow a fixed quota of Mexican steel into the United States at low or zero tariff. Anything above that quota would be hit with the full 50% rate. It is not free trade, it is managed trade, and it shows just how much leverage Trump now holds in these talks. But Mexico has its limits. President Sheinbaum warned that if negotiations fail, Mexico will announce its own retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods. She has called Trump's national security justification for steel duties baseless, and her government is preparing its own legal and economic response. So, here we are, 3 countries, 1 continent, and a trade war that has spilled into the electric grid, the steel mills, the auto factories, and the supermarkets, because tariffs are not just about taxes, they are about consequences. And those consequences are now being felt across every sector of the North American economy. Electricity is only the beginning. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button to show your support to the channel. Ontario's surcharge has already raised costs for American utilities, and even though Minnesota officials say the impact is negligible for now, grid operators are warning of longer-term instability. New York relies on Canada for nearly 10% of its electricity. New England imported nearly 9% of its power from Canada last year. These are not optional sources. These are lifelines. If Ontario, Quebec, or Manitoba were to cut supply entirely, or even reduce it during peak summer demand, the fallout could be catastrophic. Grid failures, blackouts, emergency load shedding, and billions of dollars in economic losses. Meanwhile, Canadian energy exports to the United States are already shifting. For the first time in history, Canada shipped more crude oil to China than to the United States in April. Why? Because Ottawa is actively diversifying. They no longer trust Washington. Canadian labor unions are calling for something even more extreme. They want a full cutoff, not just of electricity, but of oil, gas, and critical minerals. Their message is blunt. If Trump will not back down, why should Canada supply the resources that power his economy? British Columbia is taking a different approach. Instead of taxing electricity, Premier David Eby is preparing a fee on U.S. commercial trucks that travel through British Columbia en route to Alaska. The goal: to target Alaska's supply chain and send a message to the Republican base. Meanwhile, the western provinces are watching the energy war unfold with growing unease. Droughts have made British Columbia a net importer of power recently. They cannot afford to stop exports yet, but that may change if the conflict spreads. And spread it will, because the U.S. tariffs are not stopping. In addition to metals and energy, Trump's administration has imposed duties on everything from avocados to appliances. Mexican avocados now carry an import tax. Electronics from Mexico and China are being reclassified, and major retailers like Target and Best Buy have already announced price increases. Food prices are climbing. Electronics are getting more expensive, and economists estimate the average U.S. household will pay nearly $1,000 more per year because of these tariffs. That cost is real, and it is growing. The U.S. stock market has already reacted. The S&P with ton sticking out 500 entered a correction in April. Consumer sentiment has fallen to levels not seen since the inflation crisis of 2022. And the Congressional Budget Office now projects a 2.8% contraction in U.S. GDP for the first quarter alone. North America's auto industry is also taking a hit. Factory lines are slowing, material costs are rising, and layoffs are no longer hypothetical. They are happening. In Canada, manufacturers are calling for emergency subsidies. In Mexico, the government is preparing an economic stabilization plan, and in the United States, workers are bracing for a recession. But the biggest threat of all, it is not tariffs, it is infrastructure, because once electricity becomes a weapon, everything changes. Canada's power exports are the invisible backbone of the northeastern U.S. grid. Cut those lines, and the system will bend, then break. If this war continues, the cost will not just be economic, it will be structural. And when the lights go out, no one will care about tariff schedules or trade volumes. They will care about the truth, that this war did not have to happen, that diplomacy failed, that the wires were cut, not by enemies, but by neighbors, and that is the final tragedy, because this was never just about trade. It was about trust, and that trust is gone.